The Jetsons, 1963, issue 13. It starts with another story where George gets some new neighbors. Jane's sociable enough to want to introduce herself to the new neighbor, who takes too long saying the word yes, which he would only do if he was trying to creep them out. Which doesn't make sense, as trying to get them off-put would only inconvenience him by scaring them away. And then he couldn't take advantage of them. As I wonder if he's a vampire, and even talks like a stereotypical one, he gets thanked when he suddenly says he wants to show them around. He says he's Professor Bela-Bela, an inventor with a robot assistant he named after Igor. Obviously because he was trying to reference Frankenstein. Jane must have known that reference and been confused about why he picked it. Because it's not like robots make her uncomfortable when she's used to Rosie already. He impresses George, showing off his invention, which reminds me of the Archie's Madhouse story where Sabrina and Hilda went into tubes like this, because the invention was meant to make ugly people pretty. But it's more likely to be a body-switching invention, or teleportation tubes. I assume this room is the only one he got to show them, so that's not really showing around if he's already getting them to leave. Bela-Bela, the guy with the female-sounding name reminding me of Bella Swan, goes through the effort of petting Igor, which is sweet when he doesn't have to. Jane wonders why George is about to leave when Jane has just one more button to push before dinner's ready. And he says he wants to ask what his invention is. Jane says jokingly that she thought only women were supposed to be curious. It's confusing because this is supposed to be the 2060s. And it's impressive that it's so rare for moments like this to happen that make the comic show its age, but it doesn't matter anyways. George lies that Jane was the one who sent him over because she was curious, and he's told that in the positive tube, he can change people into robots, and in the negative tube, robots into people. This is exciting. I never thought the Jetsons would literally have a roboticizer in it. I'm glad he reminds me of vampires because it's implying that he's only able to make this witchcraft-like technology because he's supernatural. So he's powering it with his magic to begin with, while with Sonic I had to assume the natural chaos energy everywhere in the air of the world seeped into the roboticizer because of what it was made of to make it work. Igor pushes George into the tube. He gets surrounded by electricity beams and told it won't hurt. Though I'm wondering why he thinks that if there's a zap sound effect, and he looks like it does hurt. Wouldn't he know his own machine better than that? And he should know that telling him to relax couldn't get him to relax. But at least he's nice enough to try. And there's the obvious constructive criticism that it'd make more sense for him to get turned into a robot by a liquid. George ends up with bolts on his clothes, and he walks with his arms in front of him like a zombot. And Bela-Bela brags that someday he'll have an army of robots to do his bidding. Meanwhile, I have to assume the reason he looked forward to his ability to turn robots into people was that Igor always wanted to be organic, so it's not like he'd have a good reason to make robots organic in general. I guess he can't afford to buy a robot factory. And he isn't smart enough to make an automatic robot factory that he could hide and easily have an army a lot faster than this. I'm just saying he could take over the world with the robot army without having to do this to someone one at a time. I love that being roboticized doesn't ruin a character's design with their eyes turning black and red for no reason. Or red and black. And instead they keep all the same colors they had before, unlike with Zombots and Robians. A Deus Ex Machina happens because George picks him up saying he won't do his bidding and says no one tells him what to do, calling himself tough. He's reminded me of Surge. There's no way this would have happened by accident, but somehow it surprises him. I wish he had a name I could take seriously. I think the only way this would have happened to him by surprise, other than someone sabotaging his roboticizer, is if he used the wrong potion ingredients in the roboticizer, because they look similar to other potion ingredients with different effects, and he was so arrogant that he went by memory alone. I wish that was explained, because it could have had this make sense. But instead it looks like an unacceptable writer cop-out to have George able to hit Igor and escape because he's the main character. Bela looks pathetic by hoping his mechanical monster won't come back. Why wouldn't he come back? Would he try to tell the police? He can't just let him go. I guess he doesn't have any powers beyond being able to send magic into machinery a little, because it's been a while since there were full-blooded vampires in his family. I don't think him failing to make his new robots obedient to him despite Igor having that programming just fine is actually guaranteeing that he'd never be a threat with the Roboticizer, because all he'd have to do is research his Roboticizer and fix the problem. George's family sees George being in a bad mood, and Jane is smart enough to instantly know it's him instead of a look-like robot and realize what happened. It's weird that she calls him Daddy. I know she's in front of the kids, but all she'd do is call him Dad if that's why. George says he was made into a strong robot, and he's happy about it. He seems to be really smart here. Rather than angsting about this, he immediately knows it's a good thing, although he's not really thinking ahead. But then he reviews his favorite dish, and somehow thinks Jane already knows that he loves a quart of oil for his dinner. So it is a bad thing, because he can't eat normal food anymore. But surely with the level of technology this world has, it should be possible to modify him to fix that problem. We have biomass-eating robots in real life. Jane says she's gonna wait until he goes to sleep, and then try to find the switch to turn him off. That's dark. Elroy conveniently does find a switch on his body to do that. If Bela-Bela didn't expect his robots to go rogue on him, why did he think to put this here when he plans to have an army of those robots take over the world for him? That'd make the army easy to stop. It's not like the button was something only he could get to work thanks to fingerprint scanning, which even then isn't completely guaranteed to work. They didn't even need this button because he shouldn't have even woken up. They could have lifted and carried him right away and I wouldn't have questioned it. Jane plans to take him to Bela-Bela and says that he better know how to fix him if he knows what's good for him. She sure is overconfident to think her family could intimidate him into doing that. All she has to do is run after him with a rolling pin to scare him into throwing him into the tube and returning him to normal. Imagine if Robotnik was like that. To be fair, it makes perfect sense that anybody, even Robotnik, would be scared and hate having to deal with someone running after him with a rolling pin when he's defenseless. But that's why he made swap bots before roboticizing people. That's why he was able to do that to Tails' dad, because he had them around after he did that to someone for the first time and he confronted him on it. If he had more robots, then he wouldn't have needed to de-roboticize George and apologize to him because he's intimidated. Bela-Bela gets made a joke out of intentionally, as he says he always has trouble with the neighbors because he tries to experiment on them. It sure is a shame for him that he's too stupid to just make clones of them and experiment on them instead. He runs into the glass tube, hoping he wouldn't hit him just because he was in there, when he'd have no reason to think he wouldn't hit him for that reason. It's obvious he would have run in any other direction than towards this tube. It actually makes sense if George pushed him into the roboticizer instead, like especially if he bumped into him and accidentally had him fall into it, because pushing him in might be too far when you can see he felt sorry for him here. But George is selfish plenty of times. You'd think it wouldn't be out of character for him when he's already a jerk. Bela-Bela gets roboticized, and he says he feels full of joy. So rather than the roboticizer always making people think they're tough guys that don't get bossed around, it turns someone's personality into the complete opposite of what it once was, for no reason. So he's gonna give up on experimenting and do nothing but poetry. And I'm trying to picture this happening to Robotnik. George smiles and says he's nice and walks away happily and says to him to say goodbye to Igor for them, being unexpectedly nice by caring enough about Igor to say that. And Jane says they'll be harmless, nice neighbors now. I love how instantly they forgive him. It shows what nice people they really are. Bela-Bela moves his arms while gesturing and accidentally hits Igor into the de-roboticizer, which changes him into a human, despite him not having any sort of organs, so he would just die from that. So obviously it's just got a magical spell in it that turns a person from a robot into a human. Why does he decide to give himself a new name? I don't understand why he doesn't turn into George, because the de-roboticizer only would have made George come back to normal because it had the bio data that the roboticizer conveniently saved after roboticizing George. So wouldn't it still have the biodata and make Igor look like George? Igor says he's been toying with the idea of working up a black magic act and plans to do experimenting with people with the help of Bela-Bela, who's somehow smiling instead of horrified because he said he was giving it up. Him mentioning black magic as if he had any chance of using it makes the writing better because it shows definite proof that Bela-Bela has magic, or at least potion ingredients, since magic can't come out of nowhere. Bela-Bela must have put magic in Igor ahead of time, or potion ingredients with magic. Or else he'd never think he could use it because he was just a robot before, who didn't know magic even existed. The story ends here, and I'm thinking it'll be a real shame if they never show up again just because it's an episodic comic. Bela-Bela couldn't hide what happened to him forever without the police going to his apartment for tax evasion. It's inevitable that he would have to reveal himself to someone and explain how he made himself this way. Word would spread and he'd get people interested in his roboticizer. And the Jetsons world would run the risk of turning out like Sad AM. The chances of that would multiply if other people found out how to make it, which would be inevitable from people being interested in it and putting pressure on them to tell them how they made it. They bribed them with so much money that they'd never be able to turn it down. Even Robotnik wouldn't be able to turn down $1 million in exchange for the blueprints to make a roboticizer, because he'd be so confident that he'd convince himself that he'd still be able to take over the world if he agreed. And that he could easily deal with anyone trying to do the same thing to him. George's family would see them again later and realize Igor can't be trusted anymore, so they'd change their minds about thinking the roboticizer won't be misused again and can be left alone. The only way they could prevent the roboticizer from being used again is if they get Rosie to use her super strength to destroy it and get rid of the ingredients for it. The problem is that nothing would be stopping these two from calling the cops on them, telling them that they broke into their apartment to destroy their property and getting them arrested, or at least Rosie. Sure, the cops would know their story about the roboticizer's function would be true the instant they'd see Bela-Bela, but Igor could tell him to hide, and with nothing but a wild claim as an excuse for the destruction, the cops would never bother to have the pieces of the roboticizer reconstructed to see if it's really a roboticizer because they'd think it's a lie. And without a warrant, the cops wouldn't even be allowed to search the apartments for the blueprints, based on a wild claim they don't believe, because it's not like blueprints to science fiction invention are illegal. So I'm not sure the family would have the courage to send Rosie to wreck the roboticizer because they should be able to know that destroying someone's property would get you arrested. Maybe if the roboticizer gets used enough times that the family sees Igor with an army of people they used to know, especially if it included Mr. Spacely, the unemployed George would think it's worth it to get Rosie in trouble. It'd make the most sense if Rosie insisted on trying to destroy the roboticizer without permission. It goes to show you what a missed opportunity it would be to have these characters never show up again, because I ended up interested enough to say all of this about the concept. So this needed one more story to wrap this up. Bela-Bela would be living proof of it being possible to everybody, so another one would still end up built anyways. Because Rosie wouldn't get to gather up the remains of the roboticizer and have them thrown in a trash can, even if she thought of that. She'd just want to go in and out of the apartment quickly because she was doing something illegal. Especially if Bela-Bela was trying to stop her the whole time she'd be there. He didn't hate Igor in the last panel, so it didn't seem to me like he'd want his plan ruined. In the next story, Elroy asks George if he can have one of the new space boards like all the kids are getting. Why aren't they called hoverboards? That was an idea long before the 2060s. And how is this new? Somehow, George doesn't know what a spaceport is when it's obvious just from the name, and when I thought he'd refuse to get him one because it'd be life-threateningly dangerous, instead he's reckless enough to plan on making one himself. He does so, and Elroy thinks it looks embarrassing. George uses it, only for it to go too fast and send him falling a story down. He tells him to never mention spaceports again, but for some reason, it's only because he doesn't want to get himself hurt teaching him to ride one. Elroy says he could learn by himself like the other kids, and George refuses to listen to reason. Not that the reason was sound anyways, because spaceports would be getting kids hurt and killed constantly, which would be so obvious because of how high they'd let them fly, that they wouldn't even make it to the market. If there was a height limit on them, Maybe it'd be sort of believable. Then Jane surprises Elroy with the new spaceboard. He hugs her, complimenting her, and George somehow makes the mistake of running onto the board when it was in front of his eyes. And somehow Elroy says he took it when it flies away, when clearly he didn't want that. He doesn't know how to control it, as I'm wondering what's supposed to keep people on it, especially as it does a loop-de-loop. I can understand if the board trapped his feet on it. I guess his shoes are iron and the board is extremely magnetic. Jane thinks he's showing off, totally ignoring him screaming in fear somehow. Someone starts filming him in his car. George thinks he's not so bad after all, but fortunately knows he can't do those tricks willingly. He falls onto his dashboard. Elroy complains about the board being lost by accident, and George lies that he planned it that way, even though that'd get Elroy upset with him even more. By sheer coincidence, this guy is the maker of the boards, who just so happened to have one of his new supermodels in his car with him for no reason. I guess he was bringing it to a kid he knew, but didn't mind the idea of having to buy a new one when he saw George. Elroy gets a board and uses it, and George isn't worried at all from him using it without being taught how, when earlier he was saying that he doesn't want to bruise himself teaching him. Now he has total faith in him. George hopes Elroy would learn how to ride like he did, and he hopes he won't. George says he thought he was going to use the video he made of him in his new sales campaign. And he says he plans on using it to show people how not to ride boards for safety's sake. But wouldn't using that in an ad targeting kids only encourage them to do it to show off? It's good that he turned out to be smart. In the next story, outside the supermarket, Rosie somehow damages George's car, and it's actually funny how her head hangs low while she says she's very sorry, sir. And George leans back with his hand on his head melodramatically. He complains that it was apparently a new car, and wonders why she ever went to the store when she has all the modern conveniences she could ever need in the Food-O-Matic. She explains that she was storing up for an emergency power failure that hasn't happened in years. I'm guessing it'll fail in this issue. He finds out she bought candles, and expects me to believe even light bulbs are antique, without explaining what they got replaced with. It's nice of her to not want him to get a headache. He sees the food she bought and complains that it's too expensive. This is the kind of argument a husband would normally have with his wife, so it's funny to see him say this to a maid. He complains that last night he told her he wanted the family to spend less, and he wonders if she can even remember last night. She says so, but I'm still wondering if something's actually wrong with her, because otherwise it's just her being handed the idiot ball. It'd make more sense if he was mad at Judy for buying too many dresses, but that'd be boring. The doorbell rings because Rosie ordered headache powder that went out of style when the electronic massage was invented, that can be used at home from a helmet connected to the wall. Jane's happy to learn that the wood burner stove just arrived that they somehow ordered when George can't use a different stove without causing an explosion. There's a power failure, but George isn't out of luck because Jane knows that Rosie is already fixing him up some headache powder. And she hands him a lit candle, and they start preparing dinner on the wood stove. They must have researched how to do this off screen, so I'm proud of them, but it'll be lame if in the later stories they don't keep this newfound skill. I love episodic comics, but it's still easy to see why some continuity is much better than none when it comes to improvements in the status quo. Jane giggles and tells Rosie she can't go on, and Rosie giggles too, admitting that it is just a joke. George says his salary is $1,000 a week as he laughs too. He turns the lights back on, and then Rosie is told to look out as she's near the main power control that was left open. She backs into it and turns off the lights, and George decides to take them out to dinner before they drag out the candles again. They get excited by a restaurant they always wanted to eat at, only for George to be disappointed because he could have eaten at home by candlelight for free. Hopefully he'll change his tune once he discovers how delicious the restaurant food is. It sure is miraculous that any restaurants still have candles when they're considered antiques. And I'm surprised to see a robot waiter because we saw a normal waiter earlier, so it's not like all waiters were replaced with free robot labor. In the comedy page that's in color this time, we see George and Jane in the car, and the text bubbles are there without the characters as Jane nags George about driving faster than sound. This would be hypocritical of her if she's bad at driving still. In the next one, George dreams about being faced with an alien in his car, and the alien runs around him. He presses a button in his sleep somehow, causing him to dream about the alien getting punched. And what's confusing is that the punch comes from a wall above him. In the next story, George suggests bowling to Jane, and Jane asks him to go dancing. And George says she knows he sucks at dancing, and Jane says he knows she sucks at bowling. Then why did they ask each other? They had no reason to assume the other one got better at that thing. But apparently they must have out of desperation. Jane wishes they could find something they could do together instead of having to spend every evening sitting at home, with George having the paper held for him by robot arms. It's too bad George couldn't have gotten a wife that shared his interests. He sees in the newspaper that there's a place teaching both dancing and bowling, so they could take lessons. And Jane loves the idea and tells him to call them. I was thinking that they should both look for a new hobby that they'd both be good at, as unlikely as that be. But instead, George gets a robot dancing instructor who he finds attractive, despite being a robot that's gray all over and doesn't even have normal eyes. He's also happy to hold her hand immediately in front of his wife somehow. This would have made sense if the instructor looked more like Jane. It's believable that people would try to make robots that look as good looking as possible because it's pleasing to the eye for the creator, but then you remember that maid bots aren't attractive, possibly because they live with their employer, and if they were pretty they would get fired right away for tempting the husband if they don't break up the marriage first. That applies to dancing and bowling instructor bots too. A lot of them would lose their customers right away if this is a common problem for them. So that would teach the robot makers to keep it simple and have their robots look unattractive, because it only causes problems. If all of the other robots aren't shaped like attractive humans, there seems to be no reason this would suddenly be the case for dancing and bowling teachers and nothing else, just because the robot makers would like the look of these robots, because that didn't cause them to make other robots like waiter robots as good looking. I'm sure these ones were made by different people than the other robots. Jane's somehow too timid to immediately tell him what her objection is, even though she stood up to him at the drop of a hat before. I have to assume the reason the dancing instructor looks like a woman is because the robot maker thought dancing was mainly a women's hobby, because it could have easily been a typical male robot, as a robot being female doesn't serve a good purpose. Then George immediately gets a taste of his own medicine with Jane's robot instructor, as he's shaped like a handsome man in her opinion. Never mind the fact that he's gray all over, so you'd think she wouldn't find him very attractive and George wouldn't be jealous. This could easily not feel forced if these robots looked like people. For once it being sci-fi is getting in the way of a good story because they should have just been normal people like you'd expect. Why would the role of dancing and bowling teachers be entirely automated to robots made for the task? I'm assuming this because someone earlier said he makes robots that only do one thing. Never mind Rosie. Why do people think this should be done by robots for free, but George still has a job? We saw human waiters and robot waiter. So this might just be a job that all-purpose robots can apply for too. But how would one of those robots ever get hired when their competition are humans that have education and work experience on their resumes? So it can't just be a coincidence that these two are robots. The only way robots with just as much potential as humans could have a chance of getting hired would be if they went to school too. And why bother making robots like that when they'll just be competition for jobs and add to the unemployment rate? I assume Futurama has it that way because there was a huge labor shortage and so they needed to make robots for it. We see some boring panels where George and Jane suck at what they're trying to learn without cheating on their spouses, meaning that their spouses were worried for nothing, and the looks of the robots were just pointless. You'd think if it was possible for a bowling student to accidentally hit their instructor with a ball while trying to throw it, the instructor would have already learned to stand further away from the student. This must have been his first day on the job. Jane apologizes and so does George, And later on, George and Jane reunite and tell each other they learned how to bowl and dance respectively. The next night though, Jane holds a piece of paper and says the lessons cost them more than they thought, to the point where they can't afford to leave the house for a month. So the story ends with them happily holding hands while sitting on the armchairs, with George staying optimistic because being together was their main goal, and this is free. So that was it? It's sort of a relief that it avoided drama with them accusing each other of cheating. But then there wasn't any point in making the robots make the spouses jealous. In the next story, Judy complains that her current boyfriend is late for a date with her, and something's wrong with the Food-O-Matic, both problems they already had, so it makes sense that Elroy isn't interested. Elroy thinks their problems are relevant compared to Scooter being slower than Rosie, when it's obvious that the Food-O-Matic being broken is far more important because the family needs to eat, and if the Scooter was faster, he could get hurt. So no wonder they don't put any zoom in kids' scooters. Judy's boyfriend Rocky apologizes for being late and explains that his Sky car lost its zoom because a certain part of it is burnt out. So Elroy assumes he needs a part just like it for his scooter to go fast, even though it's a scooter and not a Sky car. And he plans to go to the Sky car parts store to get one. I was willing to think of Sky car as just another type of spacemobile, like how cars and trucks are all still automobiles, and not question why the term just came up, but then he said Sky car parts store, so now I had to assume this is a different universe where people call the spacemobiles by a better, faster name. Fortunately, reality ensues, as the hole is too tiny for a gusto tube to fit in the scooter. Elroy hears someone tell Jane that he fixed her Food-O-Matic because apparently it had a problem so bad even George couldn't fix it, and he throws away a certain part to it. If it was thrown away, it clearly wouldn't be working right. And yet Elroy thinks it's worth bothering with because by sheer coincidence, the gusto tube fits in the big end somehow. It's like the gizmo's an adapter that lets him connect tons of different things to a hole that he couldn't normally. How convenient that he can do that. It fits in his scooter and he's effortlessly able to fly his scooter fast. He says he always wanted to cut across the yard where a mean dog lived. The dog's sitting on a hovering platform that I guess is able to control with his thoughts alone. I assume it only exists because it's faster than a dog can go after intruders on foot. I wonder if the scooter will run out of power after he's had all his fun. Elroy flies away with the dog being tired. How's the dog tired when it was the platform doing all of the work? The platform must have been running off his life energy. That's an oddly sadistic way to program something meant for everybody's dogs. Elroy somehow thinks he could get away with sleeping late in the mornings because of how fast the scooter is, even though obviously Jane won't let him get away with that. And this must be a universe where he doesn't have a machine automatically waking him up and getting him out of bed. He sees a bully with a face like an adult. What is about the series in giving non-adults Homer Simpson muscles? Elroy calls him an idiot when he should know he would easily get revenge on him as soon as he wasn't in the scooter. I have to assume he only did this because the bully bothers him every time he sees him, and so he thinks he might as well do this. It's weird that the bully says he'll clobber the cuteness out of him, because that's acknowledging that he's cute, when he doesn't like him. The scooter avoids his punch, so we get the satisfaction of seeing him be baffled about it. Although, in the story itself, he didn't do anything wrong. Elroy says so much for his enemies, establishing that he has no other enemies in his opinion. Really? Not even the neighborhood kids that always get him mad? He wants to go to the moon, as it somehow doesn't occur to him that going too high up would kill him from oxygen deprivation. Then the scooter has a confusingly drawn flame out to save his life, and Elroy's immediately smart and calm enough to figure out that the big gusto tube put too much strain on his tiny power plant. It's unique to call a battery a power plant. His scooter starts falling with his head facing the ground. This could have easily sent him falling to his death, so he's lucky he landed in a bush. I hope he's being metaphorical when he says this is why bushes were invented. The bully and dog catch up with him. I find it hard to believe that the dog would be here when he got tired out earlier. We see Elroy start running as the narration says emergency is the mother of invention. The jerk with the hat reminded me of Jughead misses his attack, and his scooter crashes into Elroy's along with that of the dog. and Elroy explains that feet are fast enough for him. In the comedy page, Jane says Astro doesn't want to be left home alone when the family is going to drive away, when there's no room for him. So Jane realizes they could tow him in his dog cart, which gets Astro overheated because of the fire coming out of the back of the Spacemobile. Then dog carts wouldn't be sold. And I don't remember fire coming out of Spacemobiles, smoke did. So this is another universe. In another comedy page, Jane reminds Rosie to bring her and her club of friends some food, and she's overwhelmed, and gets an idea for how to bring them all what they requested at once, with Elroy's help, using wheeled cars. The first story was about a new neighbor of George with a stupid name literally roboticizing him. So that's a shocking, memorable story for a Sonic fan. But for an unexplained reason, George doesn't get reprogrammed to be obedient to Bela-Bela, so he can go to his family and cause Jane to attack him into de-roboticizing him. And then Not Robotnik is somehow stupid enough to walk into his roboticizer by accident when he could have just been accidentally shoved into it. He should have thought to make or buy a bunch of robots beforehand, because they'd intimidate the family into leaving his apartment. Plus, it could have kept George from leaving to begin with. George could have told them about the robos. So Jane would send Rosie to destroy them one by one, and Rosie could have still carried George to the de-roboticizer whether he liked it or not. It wouldn't be the first time a whole group of enemies in fiction attacked one by one for no reason, and all Rosie would have to do is move both arms, and she'd attack multiple opponents. Besides, George had a disintegrator ray before. I like that in the ending, he got turned into a good robot. It's the ideal way for this kind of plot to be resolved, with its own invention being used against him. It's too bad I have to just assume that the wrong potion ingredients are why the roboticizer not only doesn't remove free will, but also makes your personality do a 180 every time. It's too bad the ending had Igor become an evil magician, because it makes me hate that they'll never show up again. I doubt Sonic took this concept from the comic intentionally, because nobody talks about this comic as far as I know, and it's from all the way back in the 60s. The second story, after George makes a space board for Elroy despite how dangerous it'd be and fails miserably, has Jane surprise Elroy with one, only for George to run onto it in a blind rage, and his haphazard flying from not knowing how to use it causes the maker of the boards, who miraculously saw him, to present Elroy with a board of his own, conveniently. A lot of things happened that could have easily not, but the only thing forced was that the spaceports were even in production when they'd be extremely dangerous. The third story doesn't have much of a plot. George gets mad at how much Rosie and Jane are spending. But while you'd think it would build up to a revelation that there's something wrong with Rosie, it doesn't. And while the power going out when he tries to use his headache cure seems to be trying to teach George that it's good for Rosie to overspend to prepare for a power failure, it turns out that their lights only went out because they were turned out on purpose as a prank, and when Rosie actually caused a power failure, George gets them all to a restaurant before he could actually take advantage of the candles and stuff Rosie bought him, when he was just complaining about them overspending. So it would be better to just take advantage of the candles and save money. The fourth story was about George and Jane getting lessons in the other's hobby, but the confusing thing is that their instructors are robots they see as good looking, despite the fact that they're great from head to toe. But since this has a good tone, the characters stay in character because they don't cheat on their spouse or even consider it. And they're even smart enough not to ask or accuse their spouse of cheating on them, or wanting to. But that means the fact that the robots were supposedly good looking was completely pointless, only worrying a character for a few panels for nothing. So the only conflict was something that only existed in the characters' paranoid heads. The only real problem they encounter, they don't even mind it in the end. I can't honestly say it's bad that the instructors were robots, but that's only because I found it a little interesting to talk about, because it only made the story make less sense. Since most robots aren't even a little attractive, it seems arbitrary that these ones had that problem. This plot could have easily had no sci-fi at all by replacing the robots with humans. But then it'd be so boring and cliche, what would be the point? The fifth story is about Elroy wanting a scooter to be faster and finding various parts off completely unrelated machines that miraculously are compatible with the scooter. At least until the scooter flames out because it couldn't handle it. right before he was about to fly to the moon and kill himself. It's convenient for him that he could do that, and it certainly was fun to see him get away with having fun avoiding a mean dog and some trees he could have easily gotten hurt crashing into. Although we didn't see the bully do anything to deserve being taunted first, making it not as satisfying as it could be. At least the ending wasn't as depressing as it could be, because he ends the story happy with just running around, when it could have easily just been sad.